There we go. All right, let's pray. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for the blessing of your church, for the support that we feel in the midst of your church family, for the guiding that you do through it. Lord, we ask that you would shape and mold and infuse our conversations about it with your Holy Spirit, that you would fill us with confidence that you hold the future no matter what it brings. Lord, we lift up these things, especially this congregation in the midst of all of this conflict. We lift it up to you in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen. Amen. Okay. We want to begin, first of all, by introducing some folks from the strategic planning team. This is a team I've mentioned a couple of times, but if you haven't heard the spiel yet, the prevailing wisdom, at least that has been operating in the midst of our congregation, is that it's better to be prepared for a problem that never comes than to be caught flat-footed when a problem does come. So we're endeavoring to have a strategic planning team that is taking a hard look at what the possible scenarios might be, how the church might respond to various forces at work within her. That's the United Methodist Church in general. And then specifically how we as Brighton United Methodist Church will be responding to that and to make some recommendations to the congregation and to administrative council with regard to where do we go and how do we get there. The purpose of that group is, as I've tried to articulate, is to help us to make God's decision in the best possible way we can. If we can make the most God-honoring and transparent decision that we can, then I trust the outcome to God, and I'm not concerned about the outcome so much as making sure we make the right decision the right way. That's the goal of the strategic planning team. And so as we began to chew over first the 9+ proposals that were coming to General Conference already as of the middle of September, and then as we have focused in on a little bit more closely what the protocol for separation the protocol for grace through separation, I think is what it's called. I just keep calling it the protocol, has come about. We've had some more focused discussions around what those options might be. It seems to have sort of sharpened the possibilities a bit, and has, of course, produced countless pages of blogs and Facebook posts, and hours of video has been dedicated to this material to try and tease out what could happen, what might happen, what needs to happen in order to make all that happen, and you get the point. So as we were meeting with the strategic planning team, and this is informed by a couple of sister churches that are kind of on this journey together. I'm a part of a band meeting with two other United Methodist clergy, and all three of our churches are kind of forming these kinds of groups and going through this sort of informational exercise to make sure that everybody is kind of up to speed on what's going on. There's a lot of complex moving parts that you don't need to know absolutely everything about, but you need to know something about in order to make any decision in an informed way. I don't know, I just got my ballot from Adams County. I don't know if any of you are Adams County voters. I just got my ballot from Adams County, and I haven't looked at it yet, but anytime I get one of those ballots, inevitably there's 2 or 3 things on there that I haven't learned about. And thank goodness for the internet, right? We got to go and figure out. My worst. The worst is when you're faced with a choice between candidates and you've never heard of either of them. Anybody been in that boat before? Right? Yeah. No, John's never been in that boat because he's a nerd like me. But the idea that we would make a decision about something without any information seems reckless and the opposite of God honoring and transparent. So we decided that we were going to try over the course of the next several months leading up to General Conference in May to provide these opportunities for us to share some information about what's going on and to make sure that you, the congregation, are fully informed so that when it comes time for us to make a decision, if we ever get to a point where we're making a decision, we have as much of the information as we can and can make that decision in an informed way. So that's our goal. I want to begin just by introducing the strategic planning team members, many of whom are here. We've got John Myers and Karen Lawler. We've got Dale Friedholm and Sue Slaughter. Who am I missing? We've got Les Fraley is another member. Mickey Haas is also a member of that group. Bill Stieber as well is a member of that group. And Janon Swink, yeah. So not all of our members are here, but they are all sort of drawn from different corners of the leadership in our church and with various experiences and skill sets and backgrounds and even opinions about the controversies that face our church, which was intentional. I wanted that group to be able to wrestle with these as the congregation would, so we can anticipate what needs to be shared with you all. So that was the goal. The talk that I'm going to give today borrows largely from one of my good friends and colleagues, the Reverend Dr. Bob Kaler, who's the senior pastor down at Tri-Lakes United Methodist Church in Monument. And Bob leads one of the largest worshiping congregations in our conference. It's the fourth or maybe the fifth or sixth largest congregation. And he is a scholar and a historian and a veteran of the Army and quite a character, as all of us in church are. But he's a great scholar and has aided. Most of this I knew. He just organized it in a way that was quite helpful and enlightening. So I'm going to borrow heavily from his work. He also has a video where he did this presentation for his church. So if you're confused or you want to go back, we're recording the audio here, and we'll hopefully get that posted to our YouTube page this week for anybody who couldn't be here with us but is interested. But Bob also has a video on their Tri-Lakes United Methodist Church website. So we'll be providing lots of resources. If you want to go down this rabbit hole, it is an endless rabbit hole, I assure you. But we'll hopefully give you what you need today, and then if you want to dig deeper, I can point you in some great directions. So today's theme is, how did we get here? And we approach this from a couple of different reasons. One, we've added several new people to our church over the last 3 years, and as people's engagement with the congregation has grown, their interest in the future of this congregation obviously also grows. And so, but you might not have been here along the way for at least the most recent developments in this accelerated journey over the last 3 or 4 years. So wanted to provide some of that background so that everybody kind of knows. We can kind of go back and pull some of those events out of history and recent history and help you know kind of why we're even having this discussion in the denomination. But for those of you who've been along that journey the whole time, or at least most of it, this is also going to provide some sort of historical, contextual background for you a little bit to try and help us understand the roots of this conflict. And we can talk about why now, but there's an element to eventually that is built into the history of the United Methodist Church that I think is really helpful. So we're going to talk about that. First of all, before there was a United Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church was formed in 1968 out of a merger between two denominations, the Methodist Church, as it was known at the time, and the Evangelical United Brethren, or the EUB Church. And those two come together in 1968. So the United Methodist Church, as we now understand it, as it has now been conceived, is a little more than 50 years old. We're 52 years old this year. And over those 50 years, we have been fighting about various things for 52 years. So you can get that all out. But before that, we were no stranger to conflict. Okay, so before 1968, there was more than 170 years of history of the United Methodist, or of the Methodist movement in various names. So there's some interesting things for us to understand. Of course, the Methodist movement was begun by John Wesley and his brother Charles in a holiness club that was sought to renew the Church of England at the time, and this is the 18th century. So we're talking Enlightenment. Wesley, if you're familiar with philosophical studies, Wesley and scientific studies, Wesley and his comrades were very much a product of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolutions were all a part of this sort of Enlightenment we can think our way to a better future, kind of a motif, right? So in the 18th century, there was that. There was also this German pietism thing that sort of sprung up. It was basically like German Methodists, but they weren't called Methodists; they were called Pietists, but they drew on the same kinds of theological moorings that Wesley did, and so they had a lot in common. And Wesley was influenced by them, and they were influenced by Wesley. So there was a lot going on there in the dynamics of the 18th century. As we move into the 19th century, the Methodist Episcopal Church has been founded, Christmas Conference in the 1780s, 1784, I believe, and the Methodist Episcopal Church becomes its own denomination officially in North America, specifically in the United States, the colonies that become the United States. But fast forward just 50 or so years into its history, and the United Methodist Church actually experienced its first major split. In 1844, the United Methodist Church split, or not the Methodist Episcopal Church split into Methodist Episcopal Church North and Methodist Episcopal Church South. We're very original on the names back then. Over the issue of slavery. It's interesting to me that the split was actually sparked by the election of a slaveholding bishop. There was a pastor in the South who was a slaveholder, but was also a pastor in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and he was elected to bishop. That's going to become important later. But there was a slaveholding pastor who was elected bishop, and that sparked a real divide in the Methodist Episcopal Church there in 1844. And any of you know your history, it's in 1860, 61 that the Civil War begins with the secession of the South, and so we were ahead of the United States curve on the splitting, right? That's one of the things that you'll hear throughout the history of the Methodist movement in America is that we tend to really mirror all of the controversies that are happening in the culture around us. I don't know what that is exactly, but we were sort of born as the nation was being born, and whatever affects the nation seems to be deeply affecting us as a church throughout history. So slavery was the first thing to hit, and we separated into North and South. And they actually had there's interesting history about that. If you go back into the founding of different churches in the West, because this is of course 1844, so the eastern half of the United States was mostly populated. There were some Western travelers who were making ways out west, but not many. And as church planting began to happen, as Methodists began to move with the population into the West, the Anglo population anyway, into the West, the North and South had completely separate evangelistic strategies. And so different pockets of the West were founded by different versions of the Methodist Episcopal Church, either North or South, which is kind of fascinating. So some churches will trace their history to the South and some to the North. And in 1939, they remerged. But not before we had other splits, too. If you're familiar with the Methodist movement, we're sort of prone to this kind of free-thinking sort of splitting. And churches like the Church of the Nazarene was an offshoot of the Methodist movement. The Salvation Army was actually an offshoot of the English Methodist Church, which is sort of fascinating. So they have roots in the Methodist movement. There's also connections with the Assemblies of God and other holiness traditions, other charismatic and Pentecostal traditions that broke away from the Methodist Church in the early 20th century. So there's a lot of splitting going on. But by the mid-20th century, there was quite a bit of reunification. By 1939, the North and South finally buried the hatchet, or the saber, as it were, and we re-merged as the Methodist Church. We dropped the Episcopal and just became the Methodist Church in 1939. And it was in this sort of season of kind of ecumenical movements that were about. A lot of churches working together. That was kind of the theme of the mid-20th century. Establishment of groups like the Federal Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, National Council of Churches. These were big coalitions of various denominations coming together to do what we could do. We also saw this in the midst of college ministry, curiously enough. For those of you who maybe really dyed-in-the-wool Methodists, if you went to a college that had a Wesley Foundation, you may have been a part of a Wesley Foundation. And Wesley Foundation is the Methodist college campus ministries. But many campus ministries, many Wesley foundations, including the one at my alma mater at CSU, was dissolved and in favor of an ecumenical student ministry. So there was sort of a desire to be the sort of Christian students on campus rather than the Methodist students on campus, that kind of thing. So that had lots of connections. There were, as I said, there were a lot of splitting, but there started to kind of be a coalescing, a coming together of different denominations. And in that spirit, the Evangelical United Brethren Church was about 750,000 people, members at the time. The then Methodist Church was around, I believe, 10 million members at the time. So there was quite a difference there. But they bring those two together to create what became known as the United Methodist Church in 1968. But one of the big questions when you have these two different traditions coming together is sort of what is our coherent identity? If you've ever been a part of a marriage, right? You come out of one family and another family, you come together. The first question is, how do we celebrate Christmas? Have you ever had that conversation, right? There's that merging together of families. What does that mean? What is our coherent identity? How are we going to be in us? Was really the question that was there. And at being good Methodists, what did we do? I bet you can guess.
Had coffee.
Well, we didn't have coffee. I'm sure there was coffee involved. We started a committee, didn't we? That's what we did. We put together a commission. A commission was created at the birth of the United Methodist Church in 1968 to come together and to try and form a cohesive, coherent, who are we identity. Theologically, doctrinally, and morally. What is that going to look like? And they were supposed to present to the first regular general conference of the newly formed United Methodist Church. The general conference, if you don't know, meets every 4 years. And so 1968 was the inauguration of the church. We merged, and that was the big founding merging conference. So 4 years later, we had our first regular general conference, and this group was supposed to report to them in 1972. This I found very helpful. This was largely the pointing out of my colleague Bob Kaler, that 1968 could hardly have been a less tumultuous year to form any organization. I don't know. I was not alive then. Sorry, I was minus 11 in 1968. But sorry for those of you who grown at the age of your pastor. But 1968, though, I am a student of history, and I know a little bit about what was going on there. The Vietnam War was at its peak of ferocity, and of course that was having repercussions at home with lots of protests and all of that going on. I believe it was the Tet Offensive, which was the first major North Korean or North Vietnamese attack, so a lot going on. There was a lot of fighting going on. There were a lot of soldiers dying. There was a lot of protests happening. There was a lot of just this junk stuff. In the meantime, of course, you remember 1968 was the year that Nixon was elected. But of course, before that could happen, we had to endure the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. in April and Bobby Kennedy in June. And on the way to nominating and electing Richard Nixon, which turned out to be a glorious failure, right, at some point. But there was a lot going on there, right? There was a lot going on. Cold War, of course, is at its peak. We're, of course, fighting in Vietnam as a proxy war with the Russians and all that. So lot going on. In the midst of all this, theologically, what you probably aren't as aware of is that theologically, this was also probably the birthing of a lot of new thought movements, particularly in theology. There were a lot of different thought movements going on at the time, but there were a lot of different sort of progressive Protestant theological expressions that were sort of emerging, and but at the same time there was sort of a rebirth in. Sorry for the word that might be polluted for you. The evangelical movement, right? There's the sort of rise of evangelical movements that really kind of want to get back to basics in faith, and others movements that really want to take faith in a more progressive and specialized kind of way. A lot going on. So think about Billy Graham and the Jesus movement sort of happening at the same time as the sexual revolution and all of the turmoil on campuses and all of that stuff, right? So a lot of tension going on. And of course, we thought, let's found a church. That sounds awesome. There won't be any problems there. Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church had two different sets of doctrines, two different kind of sets of things. They weren't necessarily in conflict with one another, but they were different. And the solution that was proposed was not to harmonize them in any way or to come up with our own sort of statement based out of those principles, but to basically just include them both. So if you look at the discipline, even today, there are side by side the Articles of Religion from the Methodist Church at the time, and the standards from the Evangelical United Brethren Church are side by side. No attempt to harmonize or even point out similarities or anything, just side by side. And what was proposed at the 1972 conference was to create sort of a theological big tent, is the way it was described. If we can create a denomination that can have enough space for all of these myriad thought and theological perspectives to kind of coexist in one. That was sort of their proposal. We had experimental sort of liberal theologians, and we had evangelical movements. Let's just create sort of a big tent. Rather than making a statement that says this is what we believe, that would kind of be a coherent identity for us. Our identity was kind of encapsulated in this idea of a big tent. So you may have heard that expression if you're old enough in Methodism. That's a fairly common United Methodist expression, the big tent church with room for everybody. What this led to was sort of a development of interest groups, as you would expect, right? This sort of unwieldy kind of big tent theological perspective really it gave a lot of space for people to be, but it also sort of created this sort of schizophrenic kind of speaking out of both sides of our mouth kind of incoherence as well. We were kind of like a large big tent political party embroiled in what is our platform going to be, and we just boil it down to as generic a thing as we can to incorporate everybody. Essentially, is the way it goes. Meanwhile, got a very famous theologian and Methodist historian named Albert Outler, who was a professor at Perkins School of Theology, the seminary in Dallas at Southern Methodist University, came up with sort of this method. It wasn't Wesley's, and I've talked about it before, but out of reading Wesley, John Wesley, Outler identified what he described as the quadrilateral. You've heard this term before probably, if you've been around Methodism long enough. The quadrilateral is basically Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. These four elements sort of working together in concert to form the method by which we know God. Right? Now, Outler was clear from the beginning that Scripture was primary, but unfortunately, his idea about this quadrilateral gets kind of warped and misunderstood and misused to understand that all of these four elements are equal. And what happened was people kind of picked the side of the square that they liked the best, if you will, right? Some people really gravitated towards Scripture and wanted to make that sort of the main way that we know God. Other people gravitated toward their own experience and really wanted that to be the grounding. And it's kind of a mix, right? Wesley, in truth, probably saw Scripture as the foundation of all of our knowledge of God, interpreted through the lenses of experience, tradition, and reason. And we don't need to get into a master class on what the quadrilateral really means, but the idea is he sort of comes up with this idea, and it sort of feeds this. It's fuel for the fire, basically. It's fuel for this. People would identify with one side or the other and figure out where they wanted to go. But curiously enough, as we're kind of making this big tent church, 1972 also has the emergence of the language that has become the lightning rod for the controversies that face our modern church. In 1972 was the first time the language appears that says the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That language first appears in the Discipline in 1972. So if you can imagine, big tent church, and then there's this statement about sexuality that kind of marks out the boundaries of sexuality in the church. Some people will claim that that's when the church came up with this idea. I would say that as a response to the sexual revolution, it was the point at which the church needed to make that idea explicit, that it was implied and understood for centuries before that, but that it was needed to make articulate in 1972 as a response to the sexual revolution. So we have these two things kind of happening. And you can see the trains coming toward each other on the track, right? This is the way it goes. The effect here is that the roots of our conflict are sewn into the very founding of the United Methodist Church. And I would say that though sexuality in the church is kind of the tip of the iceberg, it's the presenting issue, it is absolutely not the cause. There's a lot of this sort of ambiguity about what we stand for as a church in this attempt to be a big tent church that really lays the seeds for the United Methodist Church, the conflict that we find ourselves in now. Let's see. So that was 1972. 16 years later, 1988, I was alive. Hi, I was 9. 1988, it was time for another general conference, and the African delegations, which tend to tack much more orthodox and traditional, were beginning to kind of make their presence felt at General Conference. One of the things you need to know about General Conference is that it's a representative body, and it's the only body authorized to speak for the whole United Methodist Church. The bishops can't speak for it. Individual conferences can't speak for it. Individual congregations and pastors, lay people cannot speak on behalf of the United Methodist Church. The only body that has the power to do that is General Conference. And every annual conference, which are sub-regional groups throughout the country and the world, they elect delegates to go to General Conference, anywhere from, I believe, 750 to 1,000. There's usually around 830-ish, 850-ish. Delegates are awarded to each annual conference according to their population. So the larger membership you have in your conference, the more delegates you get to General Conference. You follow me? Now this has interesting impacts because though the West would seem to be a very populous place, just in the nation, it's actually a very sparsely populated Methodist place. So, for example, the North Georgia Annual Conference, which is, as it implies, the northern half of the state of Georgia, there are more Methodists in the North Georgia Conference than are in the entire Western jurisdiction, which is the entire United States from the Kansas-Colorado border west to the Pacific Ocean, and including Hawaii and Alaska, from Mexico to Canada. So the entire Western jurisdiction has fewer Methodists in it than the North Georgia Annual Conference, which is fascinating. So that's the way it kind of populates, if you will. So that group gets together in 1988, and they're looking at these conflicting forces trying to live coherently under this big tent. There's starting to be more questions about the statement that was included about sexuality in 1972, challenges against it, attempts to change it, or even just expunge it. And so there's an attempt in 1988 to sort of reground us into something a little more coherent, rather than just saying anything goes. Let's actually make a statement about kind of where we are. And so that group adopts a new statement grounding us in the Wesleyan heritage in Scripture. But by that point, you've got 16 years. Tack on the 4 years before that General Conference, you're talking about 16 to 20 years of people kind of living into wherever they were in the midst of that big tent. And so any attempt to kind of legislate a coherent identity 20 years later, it's like 20 years into your marriage is not the time to be trying to decide who you are as a couple, right? There's there's a lot of tension there. So it doesn't matter what you legislate, it's going to kind of be whatever it's going to be, wherever it's going to be. This happens in a lot of our boards and agencies, and in our seminaries have been sort of influenced by this kind of big tent thinking, and they kind of just continue thinking that because there's really nothing to prevent them or change them from thinking that. That's sort of the way that they all kind of go. They even reaffirmed in 1988, they reaffirmed the statement that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And they added some other things as well. Specific implications of that statement become more explicit, like standards for ordination, and there begin to be statements about marriage, etc., in the Book of Discipline that kind of flush out the implications of that statement. So all that's kind of going on, but you have this conflict. You can sort of see it in the DNA, right? It's kind of in the water. So there's a lot of this caucusing going on as we try to kind of figure out who we are. There's a lot of people who try to kind of wrestle the image that Bob uses so wonderfully is we've hit the iceberg, we're the Titanic, we've hit the iceberg, and now these different caucus groups are wrestling for control of the steering wheel. And no one can wrest it from the other. We're kind of locked in this battle, right? Curiously enough, and this is not something, I guess this is something I really knew, but I hadn't really heard it put this way. Bob points out that the United Methodist Church in its 52-year history has never grown. Never grown. Never grown. We were already seeing the seeds of decline in 1968, and we have been unable to arrest that decline in America, at least, in 52 years. We have been nothing but declining in America for 52 years. Now, strange counterbalance to that is that worldwide, the United Methodist Church is actually growing. So as fast as we're shrinking in America, we're actually outpacing that in growth in places like Africa and the Philippines and Eastern Europe, which is interesting. So worldwide, the population of the Methodist Church is growing, but it's having to outpace a lot of decline in America, which is sort of fascinating. But a lot of these groups are trying to kind of vie for power and organize and coalesce into caucus groups. And if you've ever been to General Conference, I pray you are healed at some point from that experience. It is largely, it's a little, existing in the United Methodist Church in a political sense is a lot like watching Congress. The weird side effect of being born as a denomination about the same time as the United States is that our polity, the way we do church, the way we make decisions, is largely a mirror image of the political workings of the United States. We sort of adopted a lot of the political sort of apparatus of the emerging United States as we became a church. So going to a Methodist polity class is a lot like sitting through a U.S. civics class, if you've been in a U.S. civics class. Fascinating for me, not so much, probably fascinating for you, John. Not very fascinating for everybody, but so I won't bore you with all that. But there's a lot of that going on. So people are organizing. If you think special interest groups are kind of organizing to influence the levers of power in the United Methodist Church. So the conflict really comes to a head in 2004. By this point, the church has reaffirmed its position on sexuality every 4 years at General Conference, going back to 1988, and even before that to 1972. So it keeps reaffirming it, but by narrow majorities, fairly narrow majorities. If you ever want an example of the ineffectiveness of pure democracy, the United Methodist Church is probably your test case. Because what you have is you've got about 54% of the delegates, regardless of the year, about 54% of the delegates vote to sustain the language in the Book of Discipline, and about, what's the opposite of that, 46% who are seeking to change it. And that's the way almost every one of these votes has gone for 52 years. The constituencies have changed and varied, but that's where it's kind of been locked, that 54-46 kind of vote. And that's what it was. That's what it's been. But in 2004, I was in seminary at Boston University, and I've shared this in sermons before, and you've probably heard me if you've been around long enough. I was reading the Boston Globe, and it was in the middle of the General Conference, 2004, and the headline in the Boston Globe, I was surprised by this secular newspaper who had this headline, United Methodist Church declares unity. Isn't that the funniest thing you've ever heard? Right? That the United Methodist Church had become so divided and so divisive and so rancorous that we had to go the extra mile to actually explicitly declare our unity. There's irony there, right? What happened at that general conference is that there was a leader in something called the Confessing Movement, which is one of the traditional Orthodox Reform Coalition partners in the United Methodist Church, a guy named Bill Hinson, who started kind of actively engaging people in conversation around, are we at an impasse? Have we gotten to a place where this big tent is too big and unwieldy that we can't really exist in the same tent anymore? So 2004, okay, check your watches, 2020, so this was 16 years ago. Somebody finally started wondering this out loud, at least in public. And it kind of made its way through the General Conference to the point that a delegate from a lay delegate, who's now a pastor in our conference, who was from the Rocky Mountain Conference at the time, saw it. He was kind of a tech nerd, so he saw it on the internet that there was rumors that the Methodist Church was going to split, and he raced up to the dais and pointed out to the bishop who was leading the meeting that the secular news media had gotten a hold of the fact that we were at each other's throats and threatening to divide. And so there was this big attempt to make a resolution declaring the unity of the United Methodist Church, right? And it led to that odd headline that I read in the Boston Globe 16 years ago. But it didn't really solve anything. That general conference, like every general conference before it, reaffirmed the statement in the discipline, and all that went right along. But we declared our unity. So in the midst of great division, we declared our unity, at least in public. But there were growing affirmations that maybe it was time for us to start looking at this. So before we get on to the flashpoint that has created today's curiosities and sort of forced the issue with us in the denomination, it's important for us to pause for just a moment and talk about why it's so hard for us to break up. Why would that be such a difficult endeavor, right? Breakups are hard to do, right? But this breakup in particular is very difficult, and for a number of reasons. First of all, there is something called the trust clause. Many of you who are leaders in the church know about the trust clause. The trust clause was actually embedded into our polity, our way of doing church, by John Wesley as a way of enforcing doctrinal uniformity, ironically. But now the trust clause states very simply that all of the assets, both money and physical property and equipment and vehicles, and if it belongs to the church, to a congregation, it is actually held in trust. We technically own it. This was clarified for me. We technically own it as a congregation, the Brighton United Methodist Church. We own this building, but it is also held in trust by our annual conference, which is the Mountain Sky Annual Conference. Meaning that if we couldn't just take a vote tomorrow and leave the United Methodist Church, because if we did, we would have to abandon every physical and monetary asset we have, because it's held in trust by the conference. So essentially, we don't own the building or anything in it or any financial stuff in the bank. Okay, so that's one of the things, and part of that is it holds us together as a denomination. No one congregation can get a particularly skippy pastor and decide they're going to go rogue and just leave. So there are some advantages to that, right? It does kind of hold us together, and it's probably the only reason this big tent hasn't completely burned to the ground. But in truth, when there are issues that are as as the ones that we've faced recently, it also means it's impossible for a church to leave for any reason, essentially. Now, that was changed in last year. The Special General Conference, which we'll get to in a moment, actually produced a petition and approved it that did allow an exit path for congregations, but it is very costly. So now there is a way to get out of the trust clause, but it will cost us something like 5 to 7 times our annual apportionments to get out. To give you some sense of what that is, it's probably in the neighborhood of $170,000 to $200,000 in a lump sum payment to the conference for our church alone. Yeah, for our congregation. That's sort of the prevailing wisdom. And we don't have firm numbers on that because we have to get all kinds of detail, but that's generally what the idea is. Yes, Brenda. Yeah.
Situation here, that's what it would cost us to do that under the current laws and
Yeah.
guidelines.
Yeah, in order.
I understand what you're saying.
Yep. Yeah, under the current discipline that we operate under now, if we wanted to leave with our property and assets, we would have to make a lump sum payment to the conference in somewhere in the $200,000 range ish. So that's the only way out right now. So that holds us together. There's also this idea of apportionments. We've been very proudly paying our apportionments every month for 10 years. And you had a long history of paying it before I got here. We had some financial issues in the interim that prevented that from year to year sometimes, but there's always been a deep desire to pay those apportionments. And those are funds. It amounts to 13% of our income. Goes to cover the expenses of the conference and the larger denomination. It goes to cover everything from UMCOR to bishop salaries and everything in between, essentially, to run the church. And it amounts to, I can't remember what the budget was, but tens of millions of dollars a year to run the denomination. So those hold us together. There's also clergy appointments. If you're familiar with the Methodist church system, you may have noticed that sometimes they take the pastors that you have and move them somewhere else, kind of like pieces on a chessboard, and they have graciously not done that to me in the last 10 years, and I hope for many more years, but they do that, and the way it works is, I'm actually not a member of this congregation. I'm a member of the Mountain Sky Annual Conference as an ordained clergy person, and then I am appointed annually to the church that I'm supposed to serve. I'm guaranteed an appointment, but not guaranteed where that appointment will be, or how many churches that appointment will be made up from. So, but I am guaranteed a full-time appointment. And so I've been reassigned here now 10 times, going for 11, right? 10 times. I've been reassigned here annually every year. That's why July 1st I come back, the first Sunday in July, I've been reappointed, and you're stuck with me for another year. So if you don't like it, I'm sorry. But anyway, so there's the appointment system holds us together in large part. So it's true in the United Methodist Church that some of our greatest strengths can also be our largest weaknesses. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but I know for me, some of my greatest strengths are also some of my greatest weaknesses, and that's true of the church too. So a lot of these things have good reason and they've had good effect in some ways, but they've also opened the door for other problems that are a part of our institution. So we really do have this identity as a connected system, right? More than almost any organization I've ever been a part of or have ever come in contact with. For example, I recently found out that a member of my rugby team grew up going to a Methodist church. And my first question, I swear, that hit my mind was, what church did you go to? Because I probably know the pastor. Right? And you would be surprised. She's like, oh, it was in Illinois. And I was like, I might still know the pastor. I know a lot of pastors in Illinois. I didn't know her pastor growing up. But the fact that would even be a thought, I've come to understand to be a very Methodist thing. Right? If you meet another Methodist in a random situation, the first thing you do is try to figure out how you're connected, right? Because we're part of a connectional system, right? You may have shared a pastor at one time. You may have known somebody who knew somebody. It's like there's 6 degrees of separation in the world. There's probably 3 when you factor in Methodism, right, at most, that we're a connected bunch. So approaching 2016, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, 2004, 2016, there was a ramp up, a real sense that maybe the tide was shifting and maybe the discipline could be changed, and so there was a lot of intentional efforts to protest the Book of Discipline. There were some clergy who performed same-sex marriages, for example, which is prohibited by our discipline. On the eve of General Conference in 2016, there were even some clergy who came out as self-avowed practicing homosexuals and married their partners in public for the first time. So there was a lot of that. Even bishops were getting involved, doing some of that. So there was a lot of that on the sort of build up to May of 2016. And General Conference meets, and again, rumors began to circulate that maybe things aren't going to go well. And from experience, people are starting to learn that General Conference, the numbers aren't shifting at General Conference. They might be shifting in American culture. They may even be shifting in the American church. But because the American church is shrinking, and remember, your number of delegates is proportional to your number of members, the African delegation, which is now over 30%, I think it's 32% of General Conference delegates come from Africa now. As the members in the United States have become more progressive, they've been held in balance with a fast-growing constituency from Africa. And so there's been this kind, like I said, it's been 54-46 for 50 years. That's kind of been, and it's been a different group, but that's about been the split since this whole thing started. So it looks like that slim majority is going to not only retain the language in the discipline, but may even be able to strengthen that stance in the discipline. There's an effort to maybe halt that train. And so some very famous large church pastors get together, and you would know some of them. Adam Hamilton is one of them. There's another guy, Mike Slaughter, and a couple of other prominent Methodist pastors from across the world. They got together and they petitioned the bishops to lead in 2016. They said, let's just put the pause on all of this rancor about the sexuality issue. At this conference, let's empower the bishops to create a commission. What do we Methodists do when there's a problem? We start a committee, right? So the General Conference was persuaded to put the pause on all of the issues of sexuality that were coming before it, and empower the bishops to set up what was later named the Commission on a Way Forward. 32 members of the commission were to gather together over the course of about a year and a half to craft possible plans for the unity of the church in the midst of the conflict over sexuality. Handed that mantle, right, find a way for us to remain a united church in the midst of our conflict over sexuality. That's what they set about trying to do. And they came up with 3 plans, okay? They came up with these 3 plans that, we'll get to the 3 plans in a sec. So they decided to do that. And they parted General Conference knowing that this group would get together and start working on it. We would call a special General Conference outside our every 4-year cycle, and that would be when we would deal with just this issue based on the recommendations of this group. And the bishops began recruiting people and identifying who they wanted, and they established the group. Now that was in May of 2016. In July of 2016, another body, subgroup of the United Methodist Church, the Western Jurisdiction, gathered. And if you're unfamiliar with these specific terms, I can clear them up for you if you have questions. But the jurisdiction is a subgroup. We're the Western Jurisdiction. So that's that group I said was smaller in population than North Georgia. All of Western United States, the western third of the United States, including Hawaii and Alaska, from Colorado to California, essentially. So that whole group sent delegates to this Western jurisdiction, and the jurisdiction's pretty much their only job. They have a couple of other small jobs, but their only really significant job is to elect bishops and then assign them to the conferences that they will oversee. And the Western jurisdiction in July of 2016, from a slate of it started off about 20 different candidates for bishop, boiled it down to electing the Reverend Dr. Karen Oliveto. The only problem is that Karen Oliveto is an open lesbian who is married to another woman. And so we had the election of the first openly gay bishop in the history of the United Methodist Church. Remember I said that the split in 1844 was over the election of a slaveholding bishop in the South? So it's ironic that this would be the thing that sort of tips us into the controversy that we now face now, full long. So she's elected, and then the powers that be decide that this is going to be the conference that she's going to come and lead. So she comes to take over the head of what was then the Rocky Mountain Conference, which is our legacy conference, and the Yellowstone Conference, which is to our north, and the two have since merged a couple of years ago into the Mountain Sky Conference. So she came to lead the two conferences, and we're now one conference. That was not a result of her doing. That was years of planning ahead. It just kind of, they handed the ball off to her, and we unified a couple years ago. So that kind of happened. And one of the things that has set up in the midst of that, there's been a lot of happenings since. There's been a lot of legal challenges through our Judicial Council, which is kind of like our Methodist Supreme Court. Remember that U.S. Civics class? So the Judicial Council has met and has ruled a couple of things, and because of the way the United Methodist Church was, because of the compromises that were a part of the creation of the United Methodist Church, it has split out powers, certain particular powers, into jurisdictions that are unenforceable from beyond those jurisdictions, if that makes sense. So let me give you an example. So in 1968 we merged, but one of the conditions of the merger was that we used to have something called the Central Conference. We still have a Central Conference, but it's different now. Something called the Central Conference, which was, we had all of these regional annual conferences all over the country, but all of the historically black churches were sort of pooled together into what was called the Central Conference before 1968. So they were their own conference within the United Methodist Church, or within the Methodist Church at the time. And in order to compromise doing away with that Central Conference and just reincorporating all of those historically black churches into their regions, into their annual conferences, in order to do that, the trade-off was that we would create jurisdictions that had exclusive power over the election and appointment of bishops. And at the root of that was a very ugly prejudice that particularly Southern churches, Southern conferences, didn't want, say, a more progressive Western or Northeast jurisdiction electing bishops and then forcing them onto Southern conferences. And of course the big question was, is the North going to elect a black bishop and then send them to lead a conference in the South, right? So there was this sort of weird sort of race swapping that happened in the midst of this compromise, right? So the compromise of we'll incorporate all the black churches into the regional annual conferences was settled by, okay, if they're not going to be separate, then we're going to make sure that they're separate from us. If that makes sense, right? Now, interestingly enough, that compromise has led to the problem we have now, because now the Western jurisdiction has elected Karen Oliveto, and nobody from outside the Western jurisdiction has any authority to do anything about it under our system. So the Council of Bishops, which is the bishops all over the world, can't force the Western jurisdiction to enforce the rules of the global church in the West, because the only people empowered to enact the rules of our sort of the executive, legislative branches, back to American civics, okay? Legislative branch, they create the legislation. The executive branch executes the legislation, right? That's basic. So things like, if you've been paying attention to modern politics, the Department of Justice, the FBI, etc., are all under the executive branch, right? And so the executives, in this case, are the bishops. The bishops are elected, and we don't have a pope. We don't have like a Methodist pope. There have been weird meanderings about that, but we don't have a Methodist pope. So the bishops elected to a region are in charge of enforcing the rules. When the bishops of a certain region decide they're universally not going to enforce those rules, there's nothing the rest of the church can do about it. So what we have now is sort of the suicide, murder, death grip going on right now, where the global denomination is such that there's no way to enforce, or there's no way for the progressives to change the discipline to reflect their views, and there's no way for the traditionalists to enforce the discipline that they have on paper in certain regions of the church. Follow me? So that's where we're at right now. And this, of course, all sort of heated up when Oliveto was elected. There was a progressive professor at Southern Methodist University who came out. I think, the best illustration of this, and that is General Conference in 2016 decided they were going to go to couples therapy. And then the Western jurisdiction went out and filed for divorce. The Western jurisdiction went out and said, no, we're not going to try to live together. We're our way or the highway, basically, is kind of the posture that they took. And so there was this, it really heated up. If you can imagine that things were kind of on a low simmer and still warm, but simmering and only popped up like once every 4 years. Well, now it's on high and boiling, and the kettle is about ready to burn through at this point. So that's kind of where we're at right now. In the midst of this, the Commission on a Way Forward was trying to find a way forward, and they proposed 3 plans. Let's do away with the language in the discipline and leave it up to regional areas, pastors, and churches. That was one proposal called the One Church Plan. That was largely opposed by the traditionalists in the church, including the Africans. And there was another proposal to basically create 3 different Methodist denominations that covered the entire United States and allow them to do their own thing but remain mildly connected. It was called the Congregational Conference Plan. That would have been a headache to legislate, and so nobody even, there was one guy I know who was really an advocate for that, and it just never really went anywhere. It's too complicated. And then there was a late addition to their proposal was a traditional plan that sought to not change the discipline's stance, but to embed in it some better mechanisms for enforcement, which turned out to be constitutionally difficult. And in 2019, just this time last year, in fact, that group was meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, for the special charge, or the special called General Conference. And many of you have been around long enough to have heard all the details there. But essentially what they did is they reaffirmed the stance of the discipline and adopted the traditional plan by that narrow 54 to 46 margin, essentially. But it was incomplete because progressives who were upset by that sought to prevent the amendments that would have made it more constitutional, essentially. We have, again, civics course, we have a Methodist constitution. If General Conference passes something that violates our constitution, then it's ruled out of order and doesn't become law. So that's what happened. We knew going in that the traditional plan as it was presented originally was problematic constitutionally in a couple places, and several places actually, and then attempts to amend that to fix those constitutional problems weren't passed, and so it ended up careening into chaos. And if you're really curious, they actually live stream this now, although I think they may be rethinking that. I'm not sure. They'll live stream it, but it's not a pretty sight. If you need a cure for insomnia, if you're really an insomniac and you need some help, it's a little bit like watching C-SPAN, but if you can believe it, less competent. Imagine less competent than Congress, essentially. It's because we only do it once every 4 years and not every day of every year. Most of us take 2 or 3 days before we're like, oh yeah, we're doing legislation, right? I'm supposed to vote and debate, and there's some rules to this, right? So it takes people a while to kind of get back into that mode, and then they hit the ground running. But it is a little bit like watching paint dry until it's not, and then it got very hard to watch in February of 2019. people in the gallery outside. It was in an indoor football stadium where the St. Louis Rams used to play before they moved back to Los Angeles. And so it was an indoor dome football stadium, and the delegates and the bishops were all down on where the football field would have been. And there was all the seating around where observers could sit and watch the proceedings. And once it became clear the traditional plan was going to pass, the gallery there erupted in protests and in constant noise until after the adjournment of the meeting. It was really quite raucous, even for Methodists. Frozen Chosen came alive, and there was a lot of raucousness going on there. And so it was hard to watch. And because it was hard to watch, and because there were people so invested in their perspectives, it meant that there was a lot of pain, a lot of emotional stuff that kind of crept out, a lot of personal things that came up as a result of that, and on both sides. And people kind of, after that meeting, retreated to their own corners of the Methodist world and began licking their wounds and deciding. That was kind of the point at which we could no longer. This is my interjecting my perspective. I think 2019 was the general conference at which we could no longer kid ourselves that we could remain unified, given our debate, our disagreements about this issue. This isn't the only issue, by the way. Any controversial issue in the culture gets ramped up and chewed through the United Methodist Church. We've done it with abortion. We've done it with, you name it, all sorts of sexuality stuff, all kinds of, border security, you name it. If it's been a big deal in the culture in the United States, it is or was a big deal in the United Methodist Church at some point. So we sort of have this sort of mirror relationship with the culture. So that's what prompted. There were several plans, as I said. There's like 9 plans that were proposed and submitted by people and conferences to the General Conference coming up this year. And you might be thinking, why on earth are we doing this after just a year? It's because last year was a special called General Conference, and this one is our regularly scheduled craziness. So we had a special one last year. This year was already on the calendar in 2016, so this is coming up. And of course, people have been posturing to try and get those levers of influence and power in the Methodist Church to try and affect the change that they want to see. That resulted in annual conferences Annual conferences met just months after General Conference last year, and they set about electing delegates to the General Conference that's coming up in May. And there were large efforts in many annual conferences to elect more progressive delegates to try and turn the tide. Remember I said it was that 54-46 split? So it wouldn't take a great number of changes in that arithmetic to come out in a different way. Even if it did, though, I think it would be hopelessly embroiled in conflict anyway, because, as I said, going into General Conference 2019, we were always destined to have about a little more than half of the church pleased with how it happened, and a little less than half of the church really ticked off, and it just depended on which side was going to be what. We've just kind of been that 54-46 split forever. So this isn't an overwhelming majority, is what I'm saying. So given that, the results of that, we're looking at the delegates and how they all shake out. It turns out that though there were progressive gains among the United States delegates, there was a reallocation of delegates by proportion, because the U.S. has been shrinking. Those, and particularly the West and the Northeast, have been shrinking, which are the more progressive areas of the United States in the church. Their gains, the progressive gains in some U.S. delegations, were in some sense offset by natural gains from Africa and the Philippines and other areas that are growing. And so the result of that was we might have more like a 52-48 split, but there's still a progressive, slim traditional majority that is expected to make it to General Conference in May. And so that resulted in traditionalists who are upset they can't enforce anything they can pass. They might be able to pass it, they can't enforce it. And progressives who are upset that they can't get it changed, but are sort of, at this point, operating outside the rules of the discipline at this point. So that brought together the coalition that that produced the protocol that we shared with you about at the beginning of January. And that's kind of where we're at. There's been some more developments with that along the way, but that's kind of that's probably more detail than you care. Some of you are maybe nodding off by now, but the idea that that's sort of how we got here. There are some recent events that have made it urgent, like the election of Olivito, the Commission on a Way Forward, and the General Conference in 2019. Those kind of trio of events have really created the circumstance that has made this a much more urgent thing in the last 3 or 4 years. But I would say that the seeds of this destruction have been planted since almost our birth. And it could have gone other ways, I'm sure it could have, but this is the way it kind of unfolded. So that's kind of where we're at. That's a lot of information, and you may have some questions, so I'm going to shut up and let you ask those questions if you have them.
What are the options that the Planning Commission is working on?
What are the options? There's, of course, all of this is up to the General Conference in May, so we won't really know all the details until they either pass or not pass it. But right now, the protocol calls for the allowing for traditional jurisdictions, annual conferences, and local churches to be empowered to decide about where to affiliate. And the protocol would create at least 2 denominations. One would be a sort of continuation of the current United Methodist Church, but with the removal of the language about sexuality, and a regionalization that would allow the United States to kind of have autonomy and be separate from the international delegations, if that makes sense. So they would basically, the United Methodist Church as it is now would continue, but would dramatically liberalize on issues of sexuality in particular. And then there would be the creation of a traditional Orthodox Methodist denomination. And that group would be able to receive whole annual conferences if they wanted, but if not, your annual conference, then your church. And the way it would work is annual conferences would decide if they wanted to go en masse to a new denomination or stick with the what's called the post-separation UMC. And then churches like ours could decide whether we wanted to go along with our conference or if we wanted to go in a different direction. Depending on where you're at will depend on what that looks like. So there are some traditional conferences that will likely go into a traditional denomination if that option is there. And there will be some progressive churches in those conferences that will seek to stick with the United Methodist Church after the separation. Our annual conference is very progressive and is a part of the Western jurisdiction, which in the whole is very progressive. And so my suspicion is that at the very least the Mountain Sky Conference will choose to stay with the post-separation UMC and work to liberalize the church's sexual stances. Or it may even go the next step further and decide that it wants to make its own denomination. That's an option under the protocol, that any group that wanted to pull together enough churches could just leave and start their own denomination and receive some seed money from the United Methodist Church. So that might be a possibility. Either way, it's going to be either a more progressive version of the UMC for our conference, or it's going to be a much more progressive independent denomination. And if that's the case, and I suspect that it will be one of those 2 options probably, some variation there, then we would, if we didn't want to go along with that decision, then we could decide to go a different direction if we wanted to. But we would only have to make a decision if we want to go somewhere other than our annual conference. Does that make sense?
We do
Sort of.
this and we stay right where we are.
If we do nothing, then we follow our annual conference into whatever denomination they choose to go to, if that makes sense.
So just like pastors can be assigned to various churches,
Yep.
can the bishop be assigned to a different region?
Yes. So there's a group called the Jurisdictional Episcopacy Committee. This is the land of big words. The Jurisdictional Episcopacy Committee is the group that has representatives from every annual conference in the jurisdiction. And once the bishops are elected, every 4 years at jurisdictional conference, they decide where the bishops are appointed for the next 4 years. The only time I've heard of a bishop not serving those 4 years is if there was some question of misconduct where they're removed from ministry for some reason, or if there was a death or something. But usually, so Olavito was appointed here as bishop in 2016. Her first 4-year term will be up following jurisdictional conference this year in August of 2020. It's fairly common practice for bishops to remain in one conference for 8 years, but it's not mandatory. So I would anticipate Olavito being returned to our conference this fall.
So just like in the U.S., like where we can impeach a president,
Uh-huh.
is there a process for impeaching somebody like that?
Interesting. No, there's really not a way of like calling for a vote to remove a bishop in that way. The only way a bishop can be removed, once you're elected bishop in the current United Methodist system, you're a bishop for life. You're still an elder, so your ordination doesn't change, but you're consecrated a bishop is the language. So she's an elder, the same as I am, but she's been consecrated to the office of bishop. And so the only way for her to stop being a bishop is for her to retire, and she'd still be a retired bishop after that. Or if charges were brought against her for violating the discipline. And this gets into one of those problems with regionalism in that, technically, the Book of Discipline has been interpreted even by the Judicial Council to mean, if applied to her situation, that she is violating the Book of Discipline as well. The church is violating the discipline by having even ordained her and then subsequently electing her as bishop. But the problem is that the people who are in charge of enforcing that are the bishops of the Western jurisdiction. And all of the bishops in the Western jurisdiction advocated for her election and have supported her. And there have been several complaints because any United Methodist could file a complaint against any clergy person, and then it's adjudicated through our system. So several people from across the world have filed charges, and the College of Bishops, the collection of bishops in the Western jurisdiction, have declined to act on those, also in violation of the discipline. But again, there's no way for a group beyond the jurisdiction to enforce that. So that's kind of you can see why this is a problem. Yeah, it's
totally ridiculous, because it's like our country's constitution. If you're totally against the constitution, why have it?
Mhm.
And yet you can still get away with it. I mean, the Book of Discipline is our law, so to speak,
Mhm.
within our congregation, within our discipline,
Mhm.
but yet they're ignoring it totally. So how are we as the common people supposed to take that?
And honestly, it doesn't. For me, I don't think it honestly matters which side of the debate on the issue of sexuality in the church you live on. It honestly doesn't matter. Right now, we have rules on paper that are not being enforced in the denomination. And if the roles were reversed, I think both sides would be equally annoyed at this point, and we'd be in the same bucket. It would just be a different flavor. So there's a different. I don't think there's any. It's specifically about sexuality, which is a real personal thing and a real charged issue in our culture and obviously in our church. And so that has a lot of gasoline on the fire. But the truth is that we have rules that are continually upheld by our largest rulemaking body, and they're not enforced by the people empowered to do that. And there's no way to change that. That's kind of where we're at. So if you could just remove the issue of sexuality and just put in problem X, I think it would still be a problem that we'd have to find a solution for. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the debate and all of the passions running very high and people being very convicted in their positions and very strong advocates for their positions, the problem is there's no collective will to change it in one way or the other that would satisfy the other. Does that make sense? There's no compromise in which we could coexist at this point. And that's what's led to the real steam. There was a lot of emphasis going into General Conference last February at the special General Conference. There was a huge majority on both sides, both traditional and progressive in the church, that were calling for a solution that maintained unity. That unity was the number one goal. And you saw it in both sides as they advocated for their particular plan that they preferred, that they wanted to find a way to be unified, to still be the United Methodist Church, but solve this problem. And I think what General Conference 2019 did is it broke us. It revealed to us that we have mutually exclusive priorities. Yeah, priorities. That one can't be resolved without alienating the other. That one side, we can't have greater enforcement without alienating progressives, and we can't have a loosening of the Book of Discipline restrictions on sexuality in the church without alienating traditionalists. And so, and neither side is going to be happy with anything short of that, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where we're at. And I think coming out of General Conference 2019, there was this final sort of exhale and realization that, okay, we're here. It's time for us to stop pretending we're united and figure out how we can move forward.
Divorce is imminent.
Yeah. Yes, Brenda.
Maybe the topic of the rules and regulations and how the churches function and stuff. I want to know, did Jesus speak to the point of sexuality? Did he say that can't be forgiven or shouldn't be tolerated? Did he speak to that? Because that's who we're taught to reach out to speak to, counsel from, to emulate,
Mm-hmm.
is Jesus' position on this.
Mm-hmm.
You may not want to speak to this right now, but I think it's something that all of us need to explore and find out.
Mm-hmm. We have talked about that in class settings, and I certainly have my view on it, but you would be surprised at how controversial the answer to that question could be.
No, I wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I don't think.
I would,
There was a clear answer, but I didn't know.
yeah.
Speaking from ignorance, I'm not talking from knowledge of I
Mhm.
haven't been in the classes when they've explored those
Mhm.
things.
Mhm.
I
I would say that,
read the Bible several times and studied it on my own and so forth, but I don't recall a clear answer that came to my mind
Mhm.
on that issue. And so I felt like maybe that was not something that we had received directly information on
Mhm.
in our Bible. I don't know.
so I think progressives tend to point out the fact that Jesus never speaks directly on the issue of homosexual practice explicitly. Traditionalists will come back with the alternative argument that Jesus did outline an ideal of sex is for marriage and marriage between a man and a woman. And so right there you've got opposing interpretations. And so
But the dome that I was looking at
Mhm.
was forgiveness
Mhm.
and tolerance and
I would say to speak specifically to something that you said, asked if that Jesus talks about this, the Bible talks about homosexual practice being unforgivable. I don't believe that the scriptures speak to any sin or behavior in human existence that is unforgivable. So there's the unforgivable sin, which is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, and no one has any idea what that is, honestly. You can ask 10 people, you'll get 12 answers about what the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit would be. But I give you my interpretation, but it doesn't have anything to do with sexuality or the expression of that.
And it doesn't deal with why we're here today, to understand the possibilities of what happens with the different perspectives within our churches.
I think that's probably better left to another day. I don't think we can adequately deal with that in this setting. But yeah, that might be something that the strategic planning team wants to make the topic of a future gathering. I know I've been a part of panels. I did a panel discussion at Mountain View United Methodist Church in Boulder, where I represented the traditional perspective on sexuality in the Bible. And there was somebody who represented another pastor who represented a sort of centrist, sort of middle way, and someone who represented a progressive perspective on that. There's my friend Bob Kaler, who I've mentioned here before, did a whole series, a 4-week series on sexuality in the Bible and understanding that from all of its different perspectives that may be useful to us in the future. But yeah. Other questions?
Not a question, but a statement.
Okay.
Regarding what Dave asked. The protocol allows a church, if we decide to separate from the United Methodist Church, to leave with our assets and our liabilities.
Mhm.
We won't have the 5-time enforcement
Yeah.
penalty to leave the United Methodist Church. We leave with our assets.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification.
Pardon me?
Yeah. So.
I thought it was only the inside assets.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, under the protocol, if we decide to leave, if we decide to affiliate with a different expression of Methodism that comes about, a different denomination that comes about as a part of this, then we would be able to leave our current affiliation with all of our assets, including the building, and the only payment that would be required is if we had a loan from the annual conference for some reason, and we do not. So our particular congregation could make the choice to leave without any penalty or payment and affiliate. Now, if we wanted to leave any denomination, just go rogue and be independent, we would owe our unfunded pension liability.
Say that again.
If we wanted to go rogue and just be a completely independent church and not affiliate,
ABC Christian Church, if you wanted to do whatever.
yeah, if we wanted to go and just be a completely independent church without an affiliation, that we would have to pay our unfunded pension liability, which would be something akin to probably it's probably about, and these are very big ballparks, but it'd probably be in the $100,000 arena, somewhere in there.
You affiliate with some other denomination.
Specifically one of the denominations created under this protocol. So either
One of those particular ones.
Yeah, either the traditional Methodist denomination that will be created or any of the other denominations that may be created as a part of this protocol. If we affiliate with any of those, then we leave with all of our assets.
And right now, there are none others. There's only one now.
Right, yeah.
There's some in the talking stage.
Yeah.
So did I get it right? You're going to set up 2 general conferences if this takes place?
Basically, yeah. Yeah, what would happen, and this is sort of emerging, so full disclosure, the traditional movement in the Methodist Church and the groundwork that's being done to create a new traditional Methodist denomination is being done by a group called the Wesleyan Covenant Association, the WCA. And just so you all know, and I'm not hiding this from anybody, that I've been a member of the WCA since its founding in 2016. They've had the express purpose of trying to reform the Methodist Church after a traditional perspective, and if that proves unworkable, then to prepare for the creation of a new denomination. So they've kind of been doing both of those at the same time. And that would be the group that would largely at least be the starting point for a new denomination. So being a part of that, I've also been a delegate to their legislative assembly for the last 2 years. So I've been kind of in the inner workings of some of that. So that group is how was I going with this? Cold meds need to kick back in. That group is working toward the creation of this traditional Methodist church and has done a lot of that work to lay the groundwork for it.
So when will that happen?
So as a part of that group, we don't have any. Again, we're all talking in hypotheticals and theoreticals. The latest information that I have, which was a conference call I was on last week, is that right now, assuming the protocol is passed, and that's the big asterisk here, assuming the protocol is passed at General Conference, the traditional denomination would be immediately formed, but would likely have a sort of interim polity that would look very much like the current discipline to get us through the gap while we finish setting up the new denomination, the WCA that is.
So basically not until after the general conference.
Yeah, so the general conference happens. If the protocol passes, then the traditional Methodists will announce the creation of the new denomination with an interim leadership and interim rules and regulations to govern things for the time being until we can have a convening conference of the new denomination and officially launch with a new set of rules and all that. And that convening conference is sort of very tentatively planned for early 2021. So January or February of 2021 probably. That's the latest I've heard. There were hopes of being able to do that convening conference in the fall, but the timetable seems tricky with that. So they've shifted to thinking maybe early in 2021 would be that. But any church, any church following, if the protocol is adopted in May, any church could or conference could decide as early as you could take the vote, essentially, where you'd want to go. Now, the wisdom of knowing what you're going to, if you're going to go to something new, would probably be helpful. So that's something the strategic planning team is looking at. What the timing would be if we were to take a vote, if we would want to, what are our options. That's the work of the strategic planning team. And by the way, that's not a closed meeting. I'll just say this right now. If you feel like this is something you're passionate about and you want to have input on or you're curious about, you're welcome to join us at any time. I don't remember when our next meeting is. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. But I can have Lisa include that in the email updates and all that, so you all have access to when we're meeting. If you want to come and join, we'd be more than happy to have you. We sort of picked people of a diverse group with a lot of talents and a lot of different leadership roles in the church so that we could, the 4th?
It is the 4th of March.
Okay. 4th at 5:30, 4th of March. So if you want to come, you're more than welcome to. The only reason we picked the people that we picked is we felt like they would be good to have in that room, and only because we had to start somewhere. So if you want to be a part of that, we're glad to have the input. But we will be working, one of the primary focuses of that group and our conversation has been about how do we provide information to you all. So communication is a real key in that group. So we'll be communicating all that we do, and if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to talk to me or any of the members of the group to get perspective. Yeah, Mick.
Well, thank you for putting the meetings together and give us general information.
If, as you suspect, the protocol is approved,
Mhm.
and if the local conference decides to go with the post-separation aspect, and Neil mentioned that a local congregation would have the option of then leaving the conference
Mhm.
with your assets.
Yep.
How long does that remain on the table? In
So the protocol itself outlines the timeline, and this could change, of course, but the timeline of the protocol is that an individual congregation would have until December 31st of 2024 to make that decision. They could make it as early as June 1st, essentially, of this year, but they'd have to make it no later than so it's not an indefinite opportunity. There is a window, but there is a 4-year window, so that's been sort of the calculation of the question that's been out there is, okay, so what does the new church look like? It's not going to be completely clear what the post-separation UMC is going to look like in the specifics, but the broader strokes I think are pretty ascertainable. So it's going to be a matter of what that looks like for us and where our convictions lie. Any other questions? And you guys have been very attentive, and I appreciate your interest and your willingness to engage this material. I know it's not interesting times. Yeah, this is definitely interesting. You're not going to get bored. You're not going to get bored this time. Yep.
Politics all over the place.
Oh man, for sure. And it's a particular kind of insanity that for some reason, and I'm not sure how this happened, if this is just an accident of history. I don't believe in accidents, honestly, but for some reason, we have always seen fit to meet as a general conference right in the middle of presidential elections. Every 4 years, you know, we elect presidents every 4 years. So I attended the general conference in 2012 as the first reserve delegate from Rocky Mountain Annual Conference. And they were telling us as we were gathering in May of 2012 that the facility we were using in Tampa, Florida was the same facility that was being prepared to be used by the Republican National Convention later that summer. So we were their dry run. We were their test run for whether or not they could handle the Republicans, which I thought was kind of funny. So yeah, I don't know why we've decided that it's a good idea to hold our quadrennial meeting the same year as the presidential election, but we have every 4 years for 52 years. Yes, the traditional church can change that and has proposed at least a 6-year window. So we'll be off that if we do that. So anyway, again, my constant refrain, if you have questions, something comes up, reach out to me. I'm glad to share with you anything I know, and anything we learn will be passed on to you. That's my pledge and my goal for you also. If you have any questions, don't feel like you're bothering me. This is a big deal in the life of our denomination and a big deal in our congregation, and I want to make sure that we are as informed and prepared for whatever comes. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate you.